and Twitter. Tonight, we're very happy to have with us Ms. Mary Morris and her latest novel, The Jazz Palace. Ms. Morris' other novels include Revenge, Acts of God, House Arrest, The Night Sky, and The Waiting Room. She's also authored 2 collections of short stories and written extensively on travel, including 4 memoirs of her solo journey. She lives in Brooklyn. She teaches writing at Sarah Lawrence College. Let's give her a great Books and Books welcome, Ms. Mary Morris.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be back in Books and Books and to be in South Florida. And thank you all for coming. So I'm going to talk about the Jazz Palace a little bit, and I'd like to talk about the process and the sort of the writing of this book, because it's sort of an interesting story in terms of the saga that is behind the writing of this book. But I'm going to start by talking about locusts. Because when I was a girl growing up in Illinois, I woke up one morning and I was 5 or 6 years old, and I looked outside and everything was brown and buzzing, and there were just insects, billions of insects everywhere. And I went down to my mother and I said, "Mom, what is this?" And she said, "Oh, don't worry, it's just locusts, and they're only going to be here for a few days, and they won't be back till you've grown up and gone to college in 17 years. Well, when I was on the 17th year of working on the Jazz Palace, I thought to myself, what were the locusts doing all that time? I mean, I remembered the locusts. I had totally forgotten about them. And then I thought, oh my gosh, I've been working on this book for as long as those locusts were dormant underground. And now I know what they were doing. They were working on the Jazz Palace. They were working on something. I don't know. I sort of jokingly like to sort of call, when I talk about this book, what took you so long? So there were a few things that took me so long, and I'm just going to sort of talk about the book a little bit and talk about process and read a little bit, and then I hope we'll have a conversation. I began the book in 1997. There were no cell phones. I think Clinton was president. There were no endless wars. It was a very different world. And I wrote an 850-page multi-generational family saga that I truly, truly loved, and my agent loved, and she sent it out to 17 publishers, and I had a career. I mean, I'd published many, many books, and I could not sell this book that I had put so much of myself into. This was in 2002, and so I, either because I'm a writer or a masochist, I don't know, maybe they're the same thing, I really don't know the difference. I print out all my rejection letters, and I keep them in a folder, and I kept all the rejections from the Jazz Palace in a folder, and I would look at them. And one of the things that people kept saying was there were too many children. Well, too many people, too many characters. Well, one of the reasons there were too many characters is because the story kind of comes from 2 places. So one place was I had a great-grandmother, Anna, who raised 22 children, and only 9 of them were her own. She kept marrying men who were widowed and had children, and they brought them to her, and then they would die. So she married about 3 men, and then she acquired 22 children, and she wound up raising all these children. And I was absolutely fascinated by Anna and all of these 22 children, and I thought that a novel with a woman that raised 22 children would be just a terrific multi-generational family saga, but nobody could really keep the children straight. And one of the things I did in the initial writing of the book was I assigned them, in the Yiddish language, there are no words for specific birds or trees. It's just bird or tree. So I have Anna going to the library and learning about woodland plants and about gems and about birds. And so she names her children after birds and woodland plants and gems. So I had this whole cast of characters in 850 pages. It was like Ben-Hur without the chariot races, basically. It was this huge, huge novel. And, I was really stunned that nobody wanted to publish it. And my agent, who's a very, very good agent, in fact, she just, Marlon James, who just won the Booker Prize, is her client. I mean, she's a terrific agent. She said to me at the time, the worst thing that ever happened to her was that she couldn't sell the Jazz Palace then. I don't think she'd say that now, but anyway, that was... So I worked on it, and I revised it, and I looked at these, critiques, and I looked at everything. And the novel began in 1915, and it ended in 1968. So it was a Chicago novel, started with an event in Chicago. It ended with the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968. So it was a big, expansive story of these generations. And so I worked on it, and I shrunk it down, and I thought, like, if you put it in the wash, it'll shrink, and that'll be somehow better. And so it was smaller, and in 2005 we went out with it again, and again it was rejected. And then we went out with it again in 2008, I think, and again it was rejected. So it was rejected 37 times. Now I'm telling you this because it has a happy ending, at least for me. So I really put it away in 2009, and I thought, okay, I was publishing other things, I was writing other things, there were other books, and I thought, it's okay, this is the book that just isn't going to happen. But it was also the book that wouldn't go away. And somehow it just kept coming back, and I found myself continuing to work on it and going back to it. And one morning, I think it was in 2012, I woke up, and it was very, very early in the morning, and I knew what was wrong with the book. I could see it. And it was a eureka moment for me. And as my husband Larry, who's here, likes to tell it, he woke up and I was sort of gone, and he thought, that's a good thing. She's not around. Maybe she's working. And I went down to my desk, and I realized that the book just went on too long. It just shouldn't have gone on to 1968. It had to end earlier. And I looked at the section that ended with the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, and I thought, if I'm going to write about the jazz age in Chicago, it's got to be compact and it's got to be tight, and this other 275 pages is probably not really part of the story. And I took it off and I put it away, and I had 220 pages left, and I thought, this is the book. This is the book I'm going to write now. And I spent a year and a half working on it, revising it, and I think making it better. And I called my agent, who is a wonderful agent, as I said, and had gone out with this book 3 other times, and I called her and I said, Ellen, I don't know if you want to have this conversation, but remember the book that we've been sending out and that nobody would buy, and blah, blah, blah. And I said, I went back to it, and I think I've got it, and I wonder if you'd consider sending it out again. And she paused, and I thought, this is the moment where your agent throws you under the bus, right? It's just where they say, okay, it's been great, loved having you, but, and she said, I always loved that book, and let's try it again. So she sent it out again, and the person who bought it was Nan Talese, who had been my editor before. Nan had rejected it 3 times. And when I said to Nan, why did you buy it this time? She said, because you got it right, which I thought was really, I think I got, I felt like I got it right. Like it just had gone on, and I sort of like to tell this story because I know there's some writers in the room here and people who certainly are interested in writing, and well, I know you're all interested in writing, but anyway. But it's been a long process for me to get this book out into the world. So essentially, the research, the revision, the rejections, all of that took a very, very long time. In terms of the research, as I was working on this book, because it's about a jazz musician, it's about jazz musicians, it's about a white musician and a black musician. And when I was working on it, a friend said to me, who's a jazz musician, and I'd call him up and I'd say, Jamie, can you tell me this? Can you tell me that? He'd give me information and help me. And he'd say, look, Mary, this should be a no-brainer for you as long as you're not writing about musicians. And I said, well, actually, I'm writing about musicians. He said, oh, you're in trouble. Because you have to figure out, you have to know how musicians think. And I understood that was the challenge that I had for whatever really silly reason. I mean, there were moments where I thought, couldn't my main character, Benny, be into goat herding or quantum mechanics or something that seemed easier? I don't know. But anyway, jazz is really complicated. And the more I worked on the book and the more I studied jazz and tried to learn about jazz, I took jazz piano lessons for 4 years. The more I tried to learn about jazz, the less I felt I understood. And yet, in some way, in a weird way, I think the elements of jazz and what I came to understand about it worked its way into the narration. I mean, there's something about the book I mean, there are solo pieces, there are ensemble pieces, there's a kind of jazziness to the book that a lot of critics have sort of noted that I wasn't even aware of in the process of writing it. But I think even though I will say, really honestly, I don't think I understand what jazz is about, I think somehow the elements of it worked its way into the sort of intuitive structure of the book. So, anyway, it was a very, very long journey. I'm going to talk about my dad for a few minutes and then I'm going to read. So my dad was born in 1902 and he lived until 2005. That's 103 years. So he lived so long that when we would order his medication, his heart medication from Walgreens, they would call up and they would say they couldn't prescribe this medication for a 3-year-old child because their computers would default. And we would have to say, no, he's 103 and he actually needs the medication. And they'd go, okay, no problem. They couldn't get it in their heads that this was actually somebody who was that old. So my dad saw like the whole 20th century. I mean, he saw everything. And he was a great storyteller. I mean, my husband who's sitting here will definitely attest to the fact that my dad loved to tell stories and talk about, everything that he saw. But there was one thing he saw that he wouldn't talk about. And that's what the book opens with, and that, I think, was possibly one of the impetuses for me to write this story, which was in Chicago in July 24th, 1915. My father was crossing the Chicago River, and a accident occurred. There were five enormous ships that were going. Okay, so Western Electric, they had woven the cables that Alexander Graham Bell used for the first transcontinental phone conversation. So the first phone calls were made at Western Electric in Chicago, Illinois. And to honor them, they were going to go on a picnic. So there were these 5 boats, and the first boat, the Eastland, was boarding that morning at 7 a.m. And 1,200 people got on board, and then there were the other ships that were waiting. And the Eastland was, for many reasons that I'm not going to go into, but I spent a lot of time at the Chicago Historical Society looking at nautical history and things like that, was a very destabilized vessel. And so 1,200 people got on board. They unmoored the Eastland, and in 20 feet of water, she turned over on her side and sank in the Chicago River, and 800 people died in the hull of that ship. 800 people going on a picnic. It's the worst river accident ever to occur in the United States of America. And it's one of the worst maritime disasters ever. We don't know about it because the people were all factory workers. They were all working class. So it's not like the Titanic. More passengers actually died on the Eastland than on the Titanic. So my dad was, in fact, a 13-year-old boy crossing the Chicago River that day, and he witnessed that accident. And he couldn't tell me about it. He couldn't really talk about it. And yet somehow the knowledge of it, one of the things I teach when I teach creative writing, I teach family lore. And I always have my students write something that's been in your family, a story that's been told down through the generations. And, that, I suppose, was my piece of family lore, that was always, we always knew that had happened, and we knew that my dad couldn't talk about it. And my dad was he was handsome, he was charismatic. At one point, he was, I think, probably the most eligible bachelor in the city of Chicago for a little while. He didn't marry till he was 45. He had children very late in life. And, he was sort of an enigma to me. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to understand the Eastland and even write this book was to sort of understand him a little bit better. So I'm going to read a couple of short passages from this, and then maybe we can talk a little bit. So my main character, Benny Lerman, has witnessed the sinking of the Eastland. And Benny's mother wants him to be a classical pianist, but Benny's been hanging out in the south side of Chicago, and if any of you know anything about the south side of Chicago in the late teens, 1920s, the music was happening there. I mean, people, for a lot of reasons, blacks were migrating to the north. Lynchings were part of it. Segregation was part of it. But a lot of it was the fact that factories in Chicago were offering African Americans one-way tickets from New Orleans to Chicago. So they would get a one-way ticket, and they'd come up, and they would get off the train, and they didn't know where to go, and so they would live in shanties along the railroad tracks that actually became called the Black Belt, because they would just live in these along the tracks. And there was a square mile of Chicago. It was like 35th Street to 41st Street, and there was a couple other blocks. It was a square mile where there were 1,000 bars. And in the 1920s, music was like everywhere. It will never, ever happen again. It was like this place that is very hard to imagine. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, among many of the reasons I wanted to write it, was I spent some time with the historian of the city of Chicago, and he took me down to the south side of Chicago, and we stood in front of what had been the Lincoln Gardens, where Louis Armstrong first hit a high F note and knocked the world off its socks, like really blew people away, right? And it was also, something to remember. In New Orleans, it was people played music. There weren't solos. Solos in jazz didn't happen until Louis Armstrong got to Chicago. Blacks didn't feel that they could stand up and take a solo. It didn't happen in New Orleans. And so, when Louis Armstrong would stand up and take that solo, it blew people's minds. Well, Tim Samuelson, who was the historian for the city of Chicago, we stood in front of a abandoned hardware store in a slum, and he said, "This is where the Lincoln Gardens used to be, and this is where the Von Damme used to be, and this is where all the clubs were, and it was nothing left of this whole heritage." And I guess I wanted to make it sort of live again in this book, and probably also try to understand my dad in the process, which not sure I did. I understood somebody. So I'm going to read a little bit from Benny and another character, and I'm going to read a very short piece for your amusement about Al Capone, who is a character in the book. It was called The Stroll, that part of South State Street where the music lived. The Dahomey stroll to some, a strip of flashing bulbs, all blue, red, and yellow, where midnight was like noon. The music was coming from there 24 hours a day, from the elite and the Von Damme, from the grand and the deluxe. It was said that if you held a trumpet in the air, it would play by itself. They called it the Bohemia of the colored folks. Rome, Athens, Jerusalem, and South State Street. Those were the epicenters of the world. Postal workers and delivery boys, hotel maids who cleaned toilets, men who hosed down the stockyard floor. They went home, took a shower, dressed to the nines, and headed out again. They put on their fur coats and sharkskin suits, their felt fedoras, their boas and flapper dresses, and moved to the music, dancing until dawn. They paused at the dance halls and the cabarets, the 1,000 bars that filled 1 square mile, dining on hot chili, chop suey, and ice cream. Then at 5 in the morning, they went to the public baths, took a long steam, went home, slept for an hour, put on their uniforms, and were back at work. Benny ambled on. Blacks in their shiny green and purple suits, women in long white gloves, cigarette holders sauntered by. He paused at the Dreamland ballroom beneath the flashing lights. Bouncers in red capes swung open doors. From inside, the sounds of horns and laughter rose. At the Firefly, Senator Sam's rhythm band from New Orleans was featured. Even from the street, the fast dance tempo made him move his feet, but it was almost too fast. He wanted something slower that suited his mood. He walked around the corner to 35th until he found the flickering red light of a coxcomb. The Rooster wasn't much of a spot, nothing fancy like Dreamland or the Firefly. It was more of a sawdust joint that served ribs, but the music caught Benny's ear as he gazed down the corridor into the smoky room with a few bare bulbs. On the door, a scribbled note read, "Napoleon Hill on trumpet." From the street, he heard the melody of the piano, the rhythm of the drums, and the soft, smooth rise of the trumpet, quiet as a secret, and Benny had to lean in to listen. He went around into the urine-soaked alley where a window was ajar and rested his back against a brick wall. There was something sad in that trumpet he'd only heard in the winter wind. It was lonely as a boy who comes home to an empty house, a boy who's lost a rabbit's foot or a china blue marble. Maybe he dropped it on the street, someone picked it up and didn't know it was his. Or maybe they just wanted to keep it for themselves. Sad as an orphan boy searching for his true father. But the sound wasn't only sad, it was something else he couldn't name. It went through him so that he didn't know where the music stopped and his body began. As the tune picked up and grew warmer, it radiated through his bones. Someone tapped him on the arm. "Past your bedtime, isn't it, son?" Benny shook his head as if wakening and stared at the policeman. Why did everyone treat him like he was a boy? He was almost 16, old enough to be out on his own. "What time is it, officer?" "Time for a fellow like you to be tucked in, don't you think?" The officer tapped his billy club against the side of the building, then pointed towards the street. "Yes, sir." Without bothering to ask again, because he couldn't bear to have his father come and fish him out, Benny caught the L. North. It was an almost empty train with 2 or 3 people on it. Night workers heading home, sleepy people who had to be at their jobs in a few hours. He collapsed into a seat as the train rumbled along. He hoped his parents were asleep and that they hadn't noticed he was gone. He didn't care. If he had to, he'd come up with a lie. The L clanged as it moved on the tracks. The stifling air smelled, the leather of tired bodies. Benny rocked back and forth. He shut his eyes. He went to that place by the window where he'd stood listening to the lilt of the trumpet. He couldn't see. "Let me play," Benny said, making a pact with no one in particular. "I'll do anything if you'll let me play." The French brought perfume to New Orleans, and with it the scent known as oil of jasmine. In the brothels where whores dabbed oil of jasmine behind their ears, on their backs of their knees and wrists. "Hey, baby," their customers chanted, "give me some of that jazz." In Storyville, where Napoleon Hill once went to look for his mother, he'd heard the music they were starting to call jazz. Once he heard it, he was done with ragtime. With jazz, he could make it up, and he didn't have to write it down. Nothing with jazz was set in stone. One change led to the next, and change was what Napoleon Hill was good at, like a chameleon, he thought, as he stood admiring himself in front of the mirror. His trumpet lay polished and shiny in its case. He was getting ready to go where he'd never been, and he wanted to make sure he looked right. A large man, he was squeezed between the narrow bed and the dresser, straightening his tie and talking to himself. He shared this room with Maddie Winslow, though he never actually slept with her. It had been their arrangement for years that he was crawling into bed as she was getting out. He wished Maddie was home so he could ask her if he was doing the right thing. She was good for that, telling him if something was right or wrong. She'd weigh it carefully and shake her head or nod, and over all the years they'd lived together, he'd listen to whatever she said. But today was her double shift, and she didn't get home until late. Napoleon played the trumpet at the Red Rooster 6 nights a week, but he could do whatever he wanted on the 7th, and that was Monday night. So Napoleon was going to cross the river and play his horn at a white establishment on the north side. He'd take Jonah up on his offer and stop by Chimbrova's saloon. All summer, until that ship toppled over in the river, the boy with the black eyes and hair and like coal had been coming by the shoestring diner for his morning coffee, which he drank just as black. Jonah didn't sleep well, and he was often late for work at Western Electric, where he assembled telephones. To make ends meet, Napoleon did an early morning shift at the shoestring, bussing tables and pouring coffee. A few days a week, those mornings he didn't even bother to go back to Maddie's to sleep. He just went straight from his gig. By 9 he was done. One morning, as he was pouring steaming cups of coffee, Napoleon noticed the dark circles under the boy's eyes. When he asked if he had trouble sleeping, Jonah told him about his drowning dreams. "I keep seeing water coming over my head." "Maybe it's your name," Napoleon said. Napoleon, it turned out, had dreams of water also. "I won't go near the stuff," he told the boy. And he believed in those dreams. In it, he wasn't in water, but he was on it. He was in a big boat, and around him the sea was roaring and the waves rising. As he struggled in his sleep, the ropes burned his wrists and irons cut his ankles. He was hungry deep in his gut and missing what he had to leave behind. Napoleon recognized it as an ancestor dream, and it had happened to someone he didn't know, but who knew him and knew where he was. Someone who wanted to warn him, he told Maddie, when she held his trembling body against hers only for the warmth, never for more. That was the way he was with her, everything. He had to be free no matter what. No one, not even his horn, could hold him down. Napoleon wasn't his real name. It was Edgar James. But he'd been Napoleon since he could remember. Even as a boy, he'd had a wrinkled brow and looked older than his years. He had small eyes and puffy cheeks like a fish, skin the color of cocoa beans, and stubby fingers with pink crescent nails. Until his growth spurt, he was a small boy with a stubborn streak. A neighbor dubbed him Napoleon. The nickname suited him, and it stuck. Napoleon liked to hum as he poured coffee on his morning shift. One day Jonah asked him, "What's with those tunes?" "It's just numbers I make up," Napoleon said. "You make them up?" Jonah asked, and Napoleon said he did. "All the time," he replied. "You write them down?" "Never write them down, don't know how." Napoleon pointed to his head. "I keep them up here." It came out that Napoleon played the trumpet. He had a regular gig at the Rooster. But Napoleon's playing didn't earn him enough to keep him in his double-breasted suits, his straight-laced shoes and gold watches and brown and gray fedoras with black bands, and what he called his roast beefs, the tuxedos he wore when he played special gigs. To keep up his expensive clothes habits, Napoleon worked days as a busboy and waiter at the shoestring diner where he'd met Jonah, then played all night at the Rooster. "Most of the boys I play with don't even know that 10 o'clock happens twice in the same day," Napoleon told Jonah, "but I've got expensive tastes, and I have to support them." Jonah said that his family ran a small saloon where people came to the north side and played ragtime and blues, and Napoleon said if he was welcome, he'd come by. Jonah hesitated for only a moment, trying to recall if a black man had ever walked into Chimbrova's before, but Jonah could not recall, nor did he care much about such things. You'd be welcome any time. For weeks, Napoleon had tried to bring himself to go. Now he felt he had to. He kept thinking about the boy with the dark circles and his fear of water, who hadn't come back to the shoestring since the Eastland went down. He should have gone sooner to see if Jonah was all right. It was just past 8 o'clock on a cool fall evening as he straightened the lapel of his gray silk suit, his pink rosy tie, his deep breath. He took a deep breath, adjusted his gray fedora, and patted the grease bags he wore around his neck. The first bag from his pale-skinned mother, High Yellow they called her. He tied it around his neck when he was 6 years old, and she'd left him wailing on his grandmother's porch. And it was the mandrake root for protection and the skin of a turtle to attract the lover when he grew older. His mother knew what he'd need in this world. She tied it solidly at his throat and kissed him on the head, and without a glance drove off in a borrowed cart. Napoleon listened to the crunch of the wheels on the dirt road as the cart churned up the gravel dust. After that, his grandmother said he'd always seemed to be listening. He listened to the wind blowing through the chinaberry trees, to the chickens clucking in the barnyard. He listened to the track callers joreeing as Gandhi dancers drove in railroad spikes. He listened to his grandmother singing as she did on their housework, or as he stood on the porch, eyes closed, listening for that cart to come back down the road. Napoleon had never been to the north side. He'd never been much above 12th Street before. He stayed close to that straight line of cottages along the railroad tracks that people were starting to call the Black Belt. He even stayed clear of the Loop. He'd been to that Five and Dime where they drank Coca-Cola from the red-bottomed cups so that whites wouldn't have to touch their lips to the same glass. He confided his travels to the shoestring on the west side and the clubs he played on the stroll. Since coming to the city and moving in with Maddie, Napoleon had never crossed the river. He'd had no reason to until now. As the streetcar clanged and coloreds got off and white people got on, soon he was the only black person on the tram. He stared out the window, surprised when he came to the river. It was a dirty green trickle. Napoleon laughed to himself. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, but this river was not like one on whose banks he'd grown up. His was a big muddy river. His big muddy river thought nothing of bursting its levees and drowning the cotton fields and inhabitants for miles. The ride across was brief, but once he was on the other side, everything looked bigger, brighter, whiter. The cars, the buildings, the people. He thought about turning back, but he was enjoying the movement of the tram as he rode, humming along, his horn resting in his lap. Then he got off at Broadway and walked until he stood in front of the sign for Chimbrova's Saloon and Suites. The corner tavern was a long 2-story building, painted rusty red. In front were canisters filled with lemon drops and sassafras balls. Napoleon could see through into the back where the bar was. He looked for a side entrance. There was a family door where the wife snuck into the tavern, but not a black man. He walked into the alley where the stables were, but he could not find the service entrance. In the fancy establishments, he had to go in the delivery entrance or the kitchen. He could never just walk in the front door as if he owned the place. So I'm going to stop that part of the reading. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So I just want to say something about Napoleon, who's kind of my favorite character. And as I was writing The Jazz Palace, I felt it was really impossible to write about Chicago and not have an African-American character in the book, and yet I didn't really feel that I could own that character. It didn't come to me. It wasn't happening. And I was really struggling with the book. I mean, one of the reasons I felt, so Chicago, if you know anything about Chicago, Chicago pretty much divides itself on 12th Street at North and South, rich and poor, black and white. It's been that way, I could talk to you about Chicago politics a lot, but we don't need to go into that. But basically, pretty much the south side of Chicago is the south side of Chicago. And I felt if Benny was going to be a white Jewish kid who was going to go down and what they called slumming in the clubs, there had to be an African-American character that he would connect with. And I just didn't happen. And one day I was going to the airport and I was sort of struggling with the book and I was thinking about it. And I was driving through the projects in a cab, I was going to Chicago actually. And as we were going through the projects in Brooklyn, there was a wall, and on the wall in big black paint, it said, "Rest in peace, Napoleon Hill." And by the time I got to the airport, he was a trumpeter. He'd moved up from the South. He had a whole life. He had a woman he'd come up with and never really had he just had a whole life to me. He came full cloth, and it was really quite wonderful. And I will say this, a friend said to me when I told this story once at a reading, she said, "Wow, it's amazing. It's great you weren't looking at your cell phone at the moment, And I thought and I said, I didn't have a cell phone then. I probably would have been playing Scrabble, because that's probably what I would have been doing. But I didn't have a phone, and so, Okay, so I'm just going to read one other really short passage just for fun, because there's a teeny little Florida mention in it. And I had a lot of fun. Once I had that 220-page manuscript that I told you about, I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to make it 220 pages, damn it, Armstrong and Capone and, all those guys are going to be in the book. I'm just going to put them in the book. And so Capone became a character, and I actually kind of grew to love the guy, I think he had a lot of problems. But anyway, I'm just going to read a very short, where does this end? I'm going to read a very short Capone passage. I could read a lot of Capone, but I'm not going to do that to you. Okay. By the way, everything that's sort of historical is true. I've researched this endlessly, but definitely retold in a fun way. On a November morning, Al Capone wanted to go duck hunting. He hadn't had a vacation in years, but he wanted one now. He thought that shooting birds out of the sky would do him good. He walked into Marshall Fields and paid $3,000 on gear for himself and his entourage. He bought a dozen pair of waders, and dark flannel shirts. He bought green hats and Bowie knives and shotguns and rain ponchos. He bought hunting rifles and silver flasks and hand-painted duck decoys, fur-lined jackets. For a week, he and his men clomped around in rubber boots and waterproof jackets. They were good marksmen, and they killed many ducks. As he trudged through the dense forests and mucky streams, Capone had time to think. After all he'd done for Chicago, the city didn't appreciate him. He tried to make people happy. He provided entertainment and booze. Public service is my motto, is what Capone said, but still they blamed him for everything. He had never killed anyone except in self-defense. He had never intentionally hurt anyone. He had brought money to many public officials and police officers and saloon keepers. He had a good heart. His family knew this. Musicians knew this. Still, he was misunderstood. There in the North Woods, Al Capone decided to leave Chicago. He was going to go to Florida, but he learned that he'd be unwelcome there as well. That's all for Florida, actually. He was 20. I thought it was like good to read that anyway. He was 29 years old, and no one wanted him, not even Florida. He had never been west, so he decided to go to Los Angeles, that far coast. It was as good a place as any to get a fresh start. Capone traveled with his bodyguards in a special car. It was designed only for him, with velvet curtains, real whiskey, and bulletproof glass. This was his first adventure. He had never been anywhere except Brooklyn, Chicago, and East Lansing. He was surprised by the vastness of the country. He didn't know that the sky could be so blue and the land stretched so far. He was humbled before so much space. He thought of his older brother, Two Gun Hart, who packed a gun in each holster and was a lawman somewhere in Kansas. He put people like his own brother in jail every day. Richard was his real name. He turned his back on his family long ago, breaking their mother's heart. Everything on this sojourn surprised him. The people were blonde with pale skin and vapid blue eyes. They were thin and tall. They grew corn and wheat, and their vast world was yellow. They lived in small towns. They had no idea how people lived in these towns or what they did in them. How did they pass so many hours of the day? These states were dry. There were no saloons or bars, not even any speakeasies to console them. What was it like for them at night? He rode through Colorado and came to the mountains. He had never seen mountains. He had never seen deserts. It all frightened him. There was nothing here. When he arrived in Los Angeles, he was greeted by the messenger from the chief of police, who told him that he had 12 hours to get out of town. Instead, Capone checked into the Biltmore. He took a tour of the houses of the stars in a bulletproof limo. He paused to admire Pickfair, the great mansion of Mary Pickford. He toured a movie studio where he watched Union soldiers fighting the Battle of Gettysburg, and he saw an actor named Buster Keaton slip on a banana peel and fall into a woman's arms. He called filmmaking a great racket. His journey ended abruptly when Detective Roughhouse Brown arrived to escort Capone out of town. "Why does everybody pick on me?" he lamented to the reporters at the Los Angeles rail terminal as he was getting ready to leave. He boarded the Santa Fe Chief. It took him east back to where he'd come from. This time the journey made him tired. He had no stamina for travel. If he could help it, he'd never go anywhere again. On his way to Chicago, the train stopped at Joliet. When Capone descended from the train to stretch his legs, he was met by 6 policemen. They had their guns pointed at him. To make matters easier, Capone handed over his .45 caliber pistol and all of his ammunition. They arrested him for carrying a concealed weapon. He spent 8 hours in a Joliet jail. Then he posted bail. He got back on the train and returned to Chicago. He was officially public enemy number 1. Thank you. I'll stop there. Thank you. I do want to say there's one other Chicago reference Miami reference that I couldn't find, but I know it's in here. At least I think it's in here, which was that at the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which everyone, of course, very famous, Capone was actually having a party on his private island or his private estate down here in Miami, and there were, I think, 1,000 people attended, and he said it was really a shame that all those people had died in that garage. So anyway, you have a rich history here if you want to tap into it vis-a-vis Chicago gangsters. So anyway, thank you very much. And do we have time for questions, Steve? I mean, I'd love to talk about craft and anything you really want to talk about, so, or not craft. We can talk about the weather also. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes. I mean, the Capone trip to L.A., I mean, Capone, you know, the thing about Capone that's very interesting, he was 22 when he arrived in Chicago. Everybody thinks, oh, he was this, you know, he was 22 years old. and he was only there for like 7 or 8 years. And he went out to L.A. He tried to leave Chicago, and so he was done being Al Capone by the time before he was 30. As we know the gangster, and so yeah, that's all historical. He went out; they wouldn't let him stay anywhere. Nobody wanted him, so he came back, and then eventually he was, he managed to avoid over 500. Whatever you call it, whatever you call it, things against him on the Volstead Act. Yeah, but they got him on tax evasion, and that's what he went to prison for. So the oldest brother, Richard Two Gun, whatever it was called. The oldest brother went to Kansas and was a U.S. Marshal, was a lawman. And he had nothing to do with the family ever again. He changed his name. I mean, his story, if I live long enough, I'd love to write the story of Two Gun Hart or whatever his name was, because, it's really fascinating, because he just totally, his whole story, he completely turned his back on his family, and it broke their mother's heart, yeah. But she had all these other boys, so whatever, But Capone really did feel misunderstood. He felt very sort of depressed that Chicago didn't appreciate him for all of the things he'd done for the city. And he also probably had tertiary syphilis. I think there's a lot of evidence that a lot of his behavior comes out of his having contracted syphilis as a young man. He and his brother both contracted syphilis. His brother was treated for it. He wasn't. So a lot of that kind of insane behavior comes out of that. But if I can share it, one of the things I loved in the research of this book was that Capone loved music and loved musicians, and he used to say he could make more money like running on milk than he made on music and jazz clubs, but he just loved musicians. And my favorite Al Capone story is there's a very famous bassist named Milt Hinton, and when Milt was 19 years old, he was a rum runner in Chicago before he was became a famous musician. He was a rum runner. And he was in a horrible accident. He was the passenger, I don't know what you call it, but he was the shotgun to the driver. And they were on a run, and there was a bad car accident, and the driver was killed, and Milt Hinton was very, very badly injured, and one of his fingers was virtually severed. And they took him to the emergency room, and the surgeon attending said, I have to amputate your finger. And Milt Hinton said, no, I'm a musician, I need my finger. And the surgeon said, there's no way I can sew your finger back on. This finger has to be amputated. And Milt Hinton said, no, I'm a musician, I need my finger. And Al Capone walked into the ER and looked at the situation and said, he's a musician, sew on his finger. And the surgeon sewed on his finger. And in fact, it was always crooked and oddly shaped, but he was able to play the bass for the rest of his entire life. And he always thanked Al Capone for making that decision for him. So, yeah, great stories. I love these stories. Yeah, Mitchell. Hi, Mitchell. How are you? Nice to see you. Yes, please add more color. Oh, really? Mm-hmm. Wait, Sally Rand was the fangirl. Yeah. Yeah, of course. Paul, sure. Sure. Was the name Kaplan? I'm going to look. Okay. Abe, okay. Right. Right. it right. Oh, embouchure, right. How did he lose his embouchure? Yeah. Uh-huh. Split. Yeah, he lost his lip. Yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 Well, if you played with Paul Whiteman, he was certainly, that was a big deal. Yeah. 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 No, no, yeah. I didn't know we have this shared history here. No, Chicago in the 20s was like, I really wanted to be there. I want to be there. Like if I could go back in time, that would be, my mother was older than my dad, but she was redhead of the week at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. And I always thought that was like, that's when Sally Rand did her fan dance and all that. Yeah, that was the Sally Rand. Really? I'm going to have to look your grandfather up, Mitchell. This is like a side of you I didn't know anything about. No, it's I love all these stories. Yes, sir. Well, okay, so a lot of what happened was well, actually the clubs did really well during Prohibition because that was when that was their heyday during Prohibition. It was actually when the repeal of Prohibition. But a number of things killed the clubs on the south side of Chicago. One was the Depression. People didn't have disposable cash, so that was definitely part of it. The end of Prohibition, in fact, impacted adversely on the clubs. But one of the things that's in the novel is the invention of the jukebox, because they didn't need live music anymore. The way, once you had the jukebox and you could put a couple pennies in a machine and hear any song you wanted to hear, you didn't need a live band anymore. And that really was one of the things that killed these clubs. But if you look at pictures of these clubs, they were unbelievable. 1,000 people would dance in these places. They were absolutely gorgeous, and everyone wore tuxedos, and everyone was just dressed to the nines. And, a lot of these clubs, there were clubs that were all white, and there were clubs that were all black, and then there were the black and tans, which interests me more, which are the clubs that, so white musicians and black musicians never could play together. Ever. They had separate unions, so there never was interracial music until Benny Goodman hired Teddy Wilson in the late 30s to be his piano man. And when people said to Benny Goodman, why did you hire Teddy Wilson, a black man? He said, well, because he was the best piano player. He didn't even, he just did it. But until then, the unions were separate and they couldn't play together. But the black and tans were places where generally they were black musicians, but blacks and whites would mingle together in those clubs. And those clubs were really, really lively and, so, yeah. It was all controlled, though, by organized crime. Everything was controlled by, especially during Prohibition, So, yes, Steve. No, let's go for it. Let's go for the stories.
My mom was born and raised in Chicago.
Okay.
I've heard a lot of stories. One of which they were living in a house quite near where the Clark Street garage was, where the St. Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
And my uncle, her brother, actually found a revolver a few blocks away, like hidden down behind some fences that they turned into the police. That's my Chicago war story from that era. But briefly reading some of this really captured the essence of all the stories I've heard about, not just the jazz, but the city and the times.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was so concentrated in these different areas. It really is a wonderful read. It reads almost like nonfiction because it's so well.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. The research? Well, no, I'm really. I read every book I could get my hands on. I spent a lot of time at the Chicago Historical Society just looking at archival photographs. I spent some time with the historian of the city of Chicago. But also, people ask me about the relationship between. Let's talk about craft for a second. The relationship between, for me, I'm only interested in research as it feeds the story. Like, so for example, there's a wonderful huge biography of Al Capone, and I probably read maybe 175 pages of it. Okay, I only read the part. I shouldn't probably tell you this, but whatever. I mean, I read the part that really related to Al Capone in Chicago, and and what his life was like in Chicago, and what kind of a, but once I read that Al Capone was a great dancer, and he loved. Now, if you see pictures of him, he's built like a vault, right? But he was light on his feet, and he had a great beat, and he loved to dance. And once I read that Al Capone was a great dancer, I thought, he's got to dance. I'm going to make him dance in my book. So, it's sort of like you read something and then it sets off a story in your mind. But I mean, I don't do research. Like people say to me, well, how do you know when the research is over? And I say, when I've lost interest. If it doesn't interest me, I'm not doing research anymore. I'm not, it has to be feeding the story. And so all of it had to feed the story of that era. So, yeah, I was kind of obsessed, I have to say. I was pretty obsessed. Do we have time for any more questions, Steve? Or?
Take one more.
Yeah.
When you decided to have the story,
Yeah.
was it two questions? Was it easy to go in and cut where you needed to?
Right.
And the second half is it a potential novel?
Well, okay, those are really interesting questions. So, the first question, to answer the first one, it was easy because I had gone through so much with this book and so many rejections, and that I kind of literally woke up one morning and I said, the book ends here. And I went down and I was able to find the exact page in the exact place. In fact, it was the end of part 1. The book had 3 parts. It was the end of part 1. I just put parts 2 and 3 away, and that was that. I've had a lot of people ask me about the other 2 parts, or the other part, and it kind of, it's funny. This is sort of a weird thing to say, but in a weird way, I thank the people who rejected it before, because there was something that wasn't as alive in those pages as in the earlier part of it. And I think that people who turned it down were right about that. I mean, nobody said to me, hey, Mary, this book should stop here. And that would have saved me a lot of time and grief, I think. But, I mean, maybe I'll go back to it at some point and look at it. I'm not sure there's enough story in that, It kind of gets domestic. And I think that's not where I want to go, Benny and his family and things like, So it was a good question. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thanks, Steve. Thank you.
Folks, if you're watching online, don't forget you still have time to give us a call. We'll get a book signed for you. I also have all of Mary's other titles as well. You can call and get some of those. For those of you here, I thank you for coming. We have her backlist as well. She'll be sitting right over here and signing for you. That was such a great presentation. Can we get another round of applause, please, for our author? That was wonderful. Thank you. And don't forget, stick around. We got another event at 8 o'clock about texting. So text your friends. Tell them it's coming up. Thanks for coming.